Doc? Doc. He turned and looked at me slowly, his glasses misted over by the whiskey. He went past me into the bathroom, and I heard water being turned on. I went over to the bar and poured myself a stiff drink, straight. I was tilting the bottle for the second time when the bathroom door opened. "Make that 2, will you, Pat?" "Certainly." I poured another one, trying to keep the bottle from rattling against the glass. He'd washed and tidied himself up, and he looked pretty much the same as he always had. The terrific inner strain was apparent only in the tight line of his mouth, the way in which he kept his lips drawn over the protruding teeth. He sat down in one of the upholstered chairs. I handed him a glass and sat down across from him. "Well, here's how, Pat." "How?" And then I banged the glass down, slopping whiskey onto the coffee table. "Damn it to hell, Doc. I'm going to tell you a few things. You may not like—" "Don't bother, Pat. I don't think you can tell me anything I don't already know." "You can't know, or—" Yes, I can know, all right. I think it might be better if I told you a few things about myself. When you know them, you can understand about Lila. You don't need to explain anything to me, Doc. You'll be hearing things from other people, and you may as well get the straight story from me. Happened about 10 years ago, Pat. I was about your age, a few years older, perhaps. My prospects didn't look half as good. I'd scraped and starved and slaved through the best years of my life to get an education, and all I'd got out of it was an assistant professorship in a jerkwater college. It would be years, I knew, before I could get any more than that, before I became a full professor, and finally, if I was lucky, a department head. The last thing I should have done, from a practical standpoint, was to get married. I got married anyway. He took another drink, glancing at me over the rim of his glass. Lila was a student of mine, working her way through as I had. We were going to keep the thing secret until she finished school, and I, or the two of us together, was making enough to establish a home. That's the way we planned it. What happened was, she became pregnant. She had to quit school and her part-time job. She had to have money, and she was going to have more when the baby came and afterward. I got it for her one day, when the registrar was out of his office. The safe was standing open. Doc, are you sure you want to tell me all this? About the money. It didn't take him long to discover it. It was missing, nor to prove that I'd taken it. I admitted it, said I'd lost it gambling. They let me resign, and the police gave me 24 hours to get out of town. I didn't dare go near Lila. I was afraid even to send her a message. She had to have that money, you see. Had to have it. I came here, about as far away from the other places I could get. I rented an office on credit, slept on the floor at night, and fixed my own meals whenever I had the money to buy food. Inside of a year, I'd built up a pretty fair practice as a consulting psychologist, so I sent for her. I'd only written her one other letter before that. I hadn't signed it or given any address, and I was afraid to say much except that I was well and she wasn't to worry. Well, she came here, Pat. Alone. I'll never forget the look on her face when I asked her where the baby was. You see, she thought I'd abandoned her. All those months she'd thought that. The baby had been born dead. I'm sorry, Doc. After all, though, it wasn't your fault. I'm afraid you and I aren't the best judges of that, Pat. We're not equipped to judge anything about her. I'd had to use my own name to establish my right to practice, so it didn't take long for my past to catch up with me. People found out who I was. They found out, but just a little late. A psychologist learns things that could be embarrassing, and there's an unusual number of such things to be learned around a state capital. I had to agree to stop practicing, but I was in. I've stayed in. And you wish you were out. Naturally. I've never belonged in this game any more than you belonged in Sandstone. Aside from the fact that I'm constantly forced to go against all my instincts and training, I just don't fit. I don't know my way around. I had the few original contacts, and I've used this place to get more. But I've had to depend on people like, well, our friend Hardesty to steer me. Being dependent upon anyone in a game of this kind has serious disadvantages. I can see that it would. He stretched lazily and stood up. Well, I'll run along now. I didn't mean to stay so long, but I thought I'd put your mind at rest about a few things. And on that seemingly commonplace remark, Dr. Roland Luther, ex-professor of psychology turned lobbyist, left the room. Doc came in the next morning while I was finishing my coffee and sat down on the bed. He asked me if I'd slept well and said the new suit looked nice on me. I made the proper replies. Not much was said after that until we reached the Capitol. We were starting up the long steps of the main entrance when he cleared his throat with a trace of embarrassment and spoke. I know you're as anxious to avoid unfavorable impressions as I am. If Mrs. Luther should visit your room again, it might be best to leave your door open. But, Doc, I didn't finish the sentence, although it was an effort to choke it off. The look of stubborn embarrassment on his face stopped me. He convinced himself all over again that Lila couldn't be at fault. She couldn't, so someone else had to be. That was that. All right, Doc. I'll remember that. Fine. Do you think you can find your way home all right tonight? I don't know when I'll be leaving, and of course you don't know your hours yet. I told him I'd be all right by myself. He hurried off. Seething inside, I walked on toward the highway department. An auto license clerk pointed out Fleming's office to me. I went down the aisle to a door at the end. It opened into a reception room with an immense executive-type desk and a white leather upholstered lounge with matching chairs. I knocked on a door marked private and tried the knob. I sat down in one of the chairs and lighted a cigarette. The nearest ashtray stood by the desk. I'd got up to move it over by me when the door behind me opened and a woman bustled in breathlessly. She was about 50, trim, sharp-featured.
What are you doing here?
I was supposed to see Mr. Fleming about a job. I'm Patrick Cosgrove.
I'm Mr. Fleming's secretary. I don't remember his mentioning your name.
Senator Berkman spoke to him about it.
Oh, Berkman. Well, that accounts for it. It probably slipped his mind.
When will Mr. Fleming be in?
I'm not sure that he can see you when he does come in. Oh, well, drop back in an hour or so if you like. I'll see what I can do.
I thanked her and left, far from happy with the situation. I thought I'd better talk things over with Doc before I went back to Fleming's office, and I went down to the restaurant hoping to catch him there. He wasn't there, and neither was Berkman. I was on the point of leaving when Hardesty hailed me. He was alone at his table. How are you, Pat? He arose beaming and shook hands. Sit right down. Out pretty early, aren't you? I didn't think it was early, but I guess it is. I was looking for Doc. He's tied up. Anything I can do? It's about the job I was supposed to have. I thought I had one with the highway department, but I'm not sure now. Well, that won't do at all. Tell me about it. Well, Mr. Fleming wasn't in his office, and his secretary practically threw me out. Let's see. Berkman was sponsoring you, wasn't he? That's not so good. You don't think I'll get a job? Oh, yes, you'll get your job. I was just thinking of the matter, objectively. Fleming's over there a few tables. We'll tag him when he starts out. Well, thanks very much. I was getting pretty worried. Glad to do it. No trouble at all. He stirred his coffee thoughtfully, smiling his warm, confident smile. Quite a little fracas we had yesterday, huh, Pat? Well, I'm sorry about that. I'll see that nothing of the kind happens again. Oh, I'm not blaming you for it, but I couldn't help feeling a little annoyed with Doc. After all, I did just about as much work on your parole as he did. He should have told you about me beforehand. I suppose you're right. One serious misstep, something of the kind that happened yesterday, for example, and Doc or no one else could save you from going back to Sandstone. For that matter, Doc himself. Yes? Oh, well, I probably shouldn't say anything like that. He might as well have said it, that Doc himself might take a notion to have me return to prison. Why don't you drop up to my office sometime, Pat? I think you and I have a great many things to talk about. I'd be glad to come. Good. Well, here comes your man. Fleming, just a moment. The tall, fat man turned slowly away from a group that was starting for the door and looked at us sourly. Hardesty took me by the elbow and drew me forward. Mr. Fleming, I want you to shake hands with Pat Cosgrove. Pat's supposed to go to work in your department, you know. Work? Fleming took the cigar out of his mouth, barely touched my hand with fat, hard fingers. Don't you ever look at the calendar, Hardesty? Pat's a good friend of Berkman's. The senator spoke to you about him? Berkman's a goddamn nuisance. Pat's all set and raring to go. Would you like to talk to him here or up in your office? Office. See Rita. Without another word, he turned and rolled slowly away. That's his secretary, Rita Kennedy. Fleming will have called her by the time you get there. It's all settled? Sure, she'll fix you up. He slapped me on the back. I'll have to run now. Don't forget that other matter. I'll remember. I went back to Fleming's office, not feeling any too sure of myself. But the moment I stepped through the door, I knew the job was mine. Rita Kennedy was hardly effusive, but she gave me one of her tight-lipped smiles and motioned for me to draw a chair up to the desk.
All right, Pat. I believe we're all organized now. Here are your gasoline mileage books, and these are your daily expense blanks. And this is your car requisition card. You know where the state garage is, just 2 blocks south?
Yes, ma'am, but...
Oh, yes. I knew there was something I'd forgotten. Excuse me a moment.
She got up, locked the drawer of the desk, and bustled into the main offices. In a minute or two, she was back with a thick stack of mimeograph sheets covered with writing and figures.
These are the survey forms, Pat. You use one for each day. You can turn them in, as many as you complete every 3 or 4 days.
I see. What am I supposed to do with them, Miss Kennedy?
Keep your mouth shut and don't leave your car parked too long in front of beer joints. The newspapers have given us some awful writings about stuff of that kind.
I left the capital and started south, wondering why I should feel ashamed of myself. A little more than 15 years before, on a day like this, I'd walked into the First State Bank of Selby and pointed my 16-gauge shotgun at the cashier. I can't tell you why I did it. I only know it wasn't planned. I'd started for the river to go hunting when I discovered I had only 2 shells. And all I'd intended when I entered the bank was to draw $1 out of my savings account. It was around noon, and old Briggs, the cashier, was by himself. I was carrying my gun because I didn't want to leave it in my stripped-down Model T. Briggs gave me a funny, teasing look and half raised his hands, and then his hands were going higher. And his look was frightened, and I was stuttering something that sounded like, "No, I'm not, I don't mean, I won't hurt you, Mr. Briggs." He toppled down to the floor inside the cage, and I started to run out on the street and call for help. Instead of that, I scooped up 6 packets of bills and shoved them down inside my sweater, and most of them fell out as I ran out the door. My car was parked around the corner, and Sheriff Nickerson was sitting on the running board. "Been wanting to see you, boy. Think I got her fixed so's you can go to you next fall. Writ my nephew up there, and he says you want to make yourself handy around his garage. He can swing your board and room and a little spending money." "That's swell," I said. I thanked him again and got in the car. And then the alarm in the bank began to clatter, and he started running, and I drove off, slowly, dazed, then faster, as fast as I could go. About a mile out of town, the car began to sputter, and I knew I was almost out of gas. I turned in at the airport and drove across the field. Frank Miller was spinning the prop of his little old 3-seater. It caught, and he ran around and crawled inside, and I was out of my car and crawling right in behind him. Judge Lipscomb Lacey was in the passenger seats. He weighed more than 300 pounds, and he was spread all over both of them. Frank said, "What the hell you think you're doing, Red? Judge Lacey's got important business in the city, and—" "Get going," I said. "I'll blast you, Frank. I swear to God I will." I squeezed in. The gun jammed right into Judge Lacey's guts, and I said I'd blast him if Frank didn't do what I said. And then I'd blast Frank. Judge Lacey's eyes went shut and his face turned green and his head lolled. And Frank said, "All right, you crazy bastard." And we were in the air, and down again, bouncing, rocking from side to side. "It won't lift us, Red. Honest to God, it won't." "I know," I said. The door of the plane opened, and there was a big crowd out there. And Sheriff Nick Nickerson reached inside and took the gun out of my hands. "Come on now, boy," he said. "We'll see about this." So I got out, and it was all over. All over except for the trial, with a court-appointed lawyer and Judge Lipscomb Lacey presiding. I'd never been ashamed of that. I was not ashamed now of that. The garage manager glanced at my requisition card and turned me over to a young Negro in overalls. He led me back to the rear, past the motorcycles and the black and white trooper cars. "Yes, sir? What kind of car you like now?" "I can have any one I want." "Well, don't believe I'd take one of them big babies. That's a mighty nice little coupe right there. No one's got no call on that." It was practically new, in a plain, unadorned black. Only the license plate identified it as a state car. "It'll do. What time do I bring it back in?" "You live here in town, sir?" "Yes, I do." "Well, most of the gentlemen that lives in town just keeps their cars." "That sounds like a pretty good arrangement." Yes, sir. Hardly no one ever kicks on it. I gave him $1 tip, put my papers up in back of the seat, and drove out. Madeline Flournoy's apartment was on the second floor of a 2-story brick building in a semi-residential district. A furniture store occupied the first floor. There was a door at the head of the stairs and another few steps up the hallway. I hesitated, then remembered the single mail slot downstairs. Both doors were hers. I knocked on the first one. It opened almost immediately. She didn't seem surprised to see me.
Where did you park your car?
Down the street on a lot.
Come on in.
She was wearing a pair of shorts, very short, and a gray wool sweatshirt. Her feet and legs were bare. The long curl of her hair was pulled up on top of her head and fastened with a single pin. The crisp brown end of it stuck out even with her forehead like a little brush.
Now, don't look in there.
And of course I did look in there, into the bedroom with its rumpled bed.
I just got up. That dog. Nothing's too hard for him as long as someone else has to do it.
Up pretty late?
Mm-hmm. Come on, I need coffee.
Perhaps I should tell you. Doc warned me I wasn't to see you.
Pooey on Doc. Who the hell is he to tell us what to do?
He's in a pretty good position to tell me what to do.
Yeah? Well, he won't know about it.
She gave my arm an impatient tug, and I went with her. There was an area to our right almost wholly blocked by a worn plush lounge. She closed the connecting door into the living room, pushed me down on the lounge, and squeezing past my knees, went into the kitchen. She came back with 2 cups of coffee and gave me one. Then she sat down, or rather stood on her knees, facing me.
You'd better put your legs up, too. There's hardly room for them that way.
This is all right.
What are you squirming for? Have to go to the bathroom? It's right there.
Thanks, no.
Now, you look here. The door's closed, and we've got all those rooms between us and the hallway. And anyway, no one ever comes up here during the day. Good gosh, if I'd known you were such a scaredy cat.
I thought you knew, or I wouldn't have come today. It might make a difference in your wanting to know me.
What am I supposed to know?
I've just been released from Sandstone. Doc got my parole for me.
Oh.
15 years. Bank robber.
I'm awfully sorry, Pat. How old were you?
Almost 18.
Almost 18. You didn't hurt anyone, did you?
I didn't even get any money. I told her a little about it, and oddly enough, I found myself laughing. She giggled delightedly. She rocked forward on her knees and burrowed her head against my shoulder. I put my coffee cup on the floor beside her and slid my arm around her. She lifted her head and looked at me. I've never known anyone quite like you.
Of course not. You never will either.
I'm in a rather peculiar position, Madeline. I can't say and do things I'd like to that a man normally would.
I wonder if it had occurred to you that I might be in a pretty peculiar position myself.
It had, and it bothered me a great deal.
Why?
'Cause I like you, to use an understatement. To give you a fuller explanation, I'd have to go into the details of what I think are the peculiarities of your position.
There will now be a brief pause while Madame Flournoy goes into a trance and interprets Professor Cosgrove's message.
I think you know what I mean.
Quiet.
Turning, she laid down and put her head in my lap. I bent my head and kissed her. She gave me 2 quick kisses in return before moving her mouth away. There was something about him, something so warm and confiding and innocent, that I wanted to thrust my hands into my pockets and keep them there. Of course, I didn't. She opened her eyes and looked up at me. She raised one small finger and put it on my lip and moved it up and down. She lowered the hand and let it lie on mine. What are you doing in all this anyway?
What are you?
That's hardly the same thing.
Isn't it? You did an impulsive, seemingly easy thing, something that seemed to promise a lot, when you were too young to judge the consequences. So did I.
I lighted a cigarette, tossing the match into my saucer. She pursed her lips and crinkled her eyes at me, and I lowered the cigarette while she took a long, deep puff.
When I first saw you on the Capitol steps yesterday, oh, yes, I did see you. I thought, there, that's it.
I thought the same thing.
I know you did, honey. And I made up my mind to bump into you on the way back or drop something. Anything to get to know you. And then I found you were with Doc, and it made me kind of sick inside. But still...
I know.
You must have had some pretty strong friends to set Doc in motion. If they could get him to swing the parole, they can probably get him to put through a pardon. Did I say something wrong?
I don't have any friends. Doc got me out on his own.
Just like that?
Just like that. I told her about the letter I'd written him.
But why, Pat? You didn't agree to... You didn't promise.
What could I promise?
But...
I know there's a reason, but the only one I can think of doesn't make sense. That I'm valuable, or will be valuable to him just by being what I am. That he thinks I will be.
Thinks?
It's just a hunch. He had a reason for getting me out. Someone else had another. His plan isn't going to come off, and the other will.
Now that doesn't make sense. Believe me, Pat, that guy knows what he's doing. Always. I've worked for him for years, and I've been on the inside of every crooked deal he's pulled. I know...
I don't feel bad about it. For a person who hasn't had to work at it to stay alive, you're pretty good.
I don't understand.
Lying. Pretending. You're Doc's right hand. You knew that he was getting me out of Sandstone. You know why he got me out. Why don't you tell me? What has he got on you that makes you afraid to talk?
Is that why you came here today, Pat? To pump me?
I didn't think I'd have to pump you. I thought you had some of the same feeling for me that I have for you.
Oh, I do, Pat.
She thrust herself upwards and clung to me tightly.
You must believe me, honey. I do feel that way.
Well, tell me then.
Don't let him make you do anything, Pat. Talk to me first. Don't do anything without talking to me. Will you promise that?
What's Doc to you, Madeline? What is he planning?
There's nothing I can tell you, Pat. If you love me, you'll have to believe that.
All right. She gave me a final squeeze.
Bet you everything's going to be all right. Bet you it will.
Betcha. I knew she was crying the second the door closed behind me. Hardesty had a suite of offices on the top floor of the city's tallest skyscraper. The legend on the series of doors leading to the reception room read, Hardesty and Hardesty, attorneys at law. And the receptionist, a querulous elderly woman, presided over a room as old-fashioned as the building was new. I put my cigarette out and folded my hands. After some 15 minutes, Hardesty came out of his office. He nodded to me, tossing some papers on the receptionist's desk. I'll be tied up the rest of the morning, Mrs. Smithson. Just make a note of any calls I have, will you? Come right on in, Pat. He closed the door on her, disapproving grunt. Friendly little thing, isn't she? An old employee. One of my grandfathers. He and my father were partners, in case you're wondering about the firm name. That must make it one of the oldest law firms in the state. Not quite what you expected, huh? You didn't think an old and respectable law firm would be mixed up with a guy like Doc? Frankly, no, although I'm not being critical of Doc. Of course not. Well, confidentially, Pat, I'm not involved with Doc a bit more than I can help. You know how it is. You want to swing a piece of business with the state, and the first thing you know, you find Doc or someone like him in your path. And you either work with him or you don't put your deal across. I nodded noncommittally. The less I had to say about Doc, the better. How long have you been out of Sandstone? Almost 3 weeks. And you're pretty worried. Don't be afraid to say so, Pat. All right. But it's a pretty hard thing to put into words. The trouble is Mrs. Luther. She won't leave me alone. Oh? She came back to my room the second night I was there, and she almost got me in very serious trouble with Doc. She's followed the same line of conduct ever since. Well, that's embarrassing, all right, but I wouldn't be too disturbed about it. Doc won't blame you for it. He shouldn't, but he does. I can't tell him it isn't my fault. I can't brush her off. I can't let her go on. Whatever I do or don't do, I have Doc angry with me. I'm afraid it might lead to my parole being canceled. And if you thought it was going to be, you'd try to make a run for it. Well, we can't have that at all. I wonder if you'd have enough influence with her to make her stop. Well, yes, I can do that little thing for you. I'd appreciate it very much. That isn't all you're worried about, Pat. I think you must know. I can't help wondering why Doc got me out of Sandstone. You can't feature Doc doing that unless he stood to cash in on it. I didn't say that. I do feel it's strange that he did it at this particular time, judging by the way Berkman was treated and some other things I've seen and heard. Doc's crowd may lose out at the election. They need everything they've got for themselves. Why should they use up a lot of their steam in helping me? Good question, Pat, but the answer is simple enough. Ever hear of Fanning Arnhold, president of National Phalanx? A big patriotic organization. The super patriotic organization. What Arnhold and the Phalanx say, we common mortals feel obliged to heed and obey. Yes? Arnhold's slated to make 6 speeches in this state. The first here in the capital about 2 weeks from today. He's going to attack a number of the textbooks now in use on the grounds that they're subversive. When he does, it's going to be an easy matter to get those texts thrown out and a new line adopted. I see. But I know you're wondering why we fool with books when we've got the oil crowd to play with. But Doc's gang does get to the oil companies. A big stink about textbooks diverts the public's attention from them. It's worth heavy dough to them to get that attention diverted. We take a double rack off. He grinned and spread his hands. A dirty business all the way around, Pat, but it's worked out to your advantage. Doc set this deal up and agreed to cut his associates in on it. In return for that, they put through your parole. But that still doesn't answer my question. Why did Doc want me paroled? I'm not sure that I can help you there. You must know. You have a great deal more to lose than Berkman and the others. You wouldn't have taken a hand in this unless you knew exactly where it was leading. My point is that you know why Doc wanted me out of Sandstone. I might, but why should I tell you? Well, I was stumped by the flatness of the question. I can't give you anything for the information, but you indicated that you were my friend, that I could trust you. Did you believe me? Well, you see how it is, Pat. You're asking for something that you won't give, and as you pointed out a moment ago, I have a great deal to lose. Tell me, don't you have any ideas of your own? Not at all. There's nothing I can do for anyone. I don't have anything that I can see but a bad reputation. Very bad. You mean that's something in itself? Let's just say it's something for you to think about. But I don't see how. Go on, Pat. You're doing fine. Well, then there's Mrs. Luther. If she got Doc sore enough at me to have my parole canceled, his plan, whatever it is, would fall through. I'd be right back where I started, and all his time and effort would be wasted. Of course, I know he's unreasonable about her, but think, Pat. Can't you think of a set of circumstances where it might be profitable to anyone for you to be returned to Sandstone? I stared at him blankly. He nodded, narrow-eyed. I can see that you can't, but you will. You'll see that and the other angle as well. When you do, when you begin to get an inkling of their significance, we'll have a talk. Thanks. I shook hands limply. You'll be all right for the time being. There's this Arnholt matter. Nothing going to happen until that's wound up. I'm glad to know that. You can depend on it. Meanwhile, I'll see what I can do about getting Mrs. Luther off your neck. I let him lead me out the hall door of his office. I trust our little talk will remain confidential. He shook hands with me again and very gently closed the door. Suddenly everything was all right. I didn't have to avoid Lila. She made a point of keeping out of my way. And on those rare occasions when we did encounter each other, she was barely polite. Almost overnight, the constraint which I had seen building up in Doc disappeared. He became the old Doc, alternatively slangy and grammatical, flippant and profound, generous, good-natured. I got paid the week following my visit to Hardesty. I hadn't worked a full month, but I was paid for one. I gave the check to Doc to cash for me, and he brought the money back to my room the next night. Smiling, he refused to take a cent of it. Just hang on to your money, Pat. You won't want to stick in one of those political jobs always, and you probably won't be able to anyway. Hang on to it. You'll have something to operate on when your parole runs out. I wonder if I should start a bank account. That's a good idea. We'll do that someday soon when I can spare the time to go down and introduce you. I left the house every morning at a reasonably early hour and never returned before 5 in the afternoon. Usually I spent an hour or so at Madeline's. The rest of the time I saw picture shows or read in the public library or drove around. One morning, a few days after payday, I drove out to the place where Doc and I had stopped my first night out of Sandstone, the place where the sludge from the oil wells had widened the river into an expanse of stinking mud. I don't think I sought the spot consciously. There was no attraction which would justify a drive of 10 miles, but I found myself there suddenly, and I pulled the car off the road and walked up to the stone bench. I sat down on it and leaned forward carefully. I scooped up a handful of pebbles and began dropping them down into the mud. It was good to be here. Here or any place it wasn't Sandstone. To be able to be off guard, to smile or laugh when you wanted to, just to breathe easily, to think instead of scheme. I leaned forward and smiled down into the black surface below, and back came another smile, my reflection, thoughtful but reassuring. Hang on to yourself, Red. Hang on, or a hand came down on my shoulder.
Better hang on to the bench, Red. You might fall in.
In one unthinking instant, I had lowered my shoulders, caught the arm, and shifted my weight forward and upwards. Luckily, she yelled, and a reflex action set in against the first one. Otherwise, Myrtle Briscoe would have gone into the river instead of down onto the bench, and I, the chances are, would have gone with her with a bullet through my head. There was a highway patrol car parked near mine, and the state trooper was bounding up the slope, tugging at his holstered .45. He almost had it out when Myrtle Briscoe leaped up and waved her arms at him.
Hold it, Tony. Damn it to hell, hold it.
You sure you're all right, Miss Briscoe?
Hell yes.
She let out a snort of laughter and made brushing motions at her clothes.
Shook up, but all together.
You sure you don't want me to...
I want you to go back to the car and sit there.
He turned and went back. Myrtle sat down, shaking her head.
Don't know why it is. Give a guy a gun and he can't wait to use it.
I've noticed that, I said, sitting down at her side. I'm sorry if I startled you, Miss Briscoe.
Oh, well. One good startle deserves another. What are you doing so far from town, Red?
I didn't think it was far.
Aren't you working?
I still have my job. I'm caught up for a few hours.
Okay. Now let me tell you something, Red. Tony and I gave you a long tale all the way from town. About an hour ago, we lost you. We go on down the road about 20 miles, and then we come back, and here you are. How do you explain that?
You mean I was trying to shake you? I didn't even know you were following me.
How come we didn't see you or at least your car?
Well, for one thing, there were probably other cars between yours and mine. Mainly, however, you didn't want to see me. You wanted to believe I was skipping out. You probably wouldn't have seen me if I'd waved a red flag at you.
Now look, Red. You know doggone well what I'm talking about. What about that car?
It belongs to the state. You know that, Miss Briscoe. Her eyes flashed. She jerked a paper from the pocket of her skirt and thrust it at me. It was one of those small legal papers which list title transfers and mortgages and similar information. Myrtle Briscoe put her fingers on a red-circled item under automobile transfer. Capital Car Company to Patrick M. Cosgrove, 42 Ford Coupe, $175.
Now I suppose it's another Cosgrove. Go on, tell me it is.
I shook my head. I didn't know what it was all about, but I knew it wouldn't be another Cosgrove. It was all done too neatly. I'd drawn a check for $250. After allowing for a month's expenses, I'd have a surplus of just about $175 to spend on a car. I hadn't done it, but I wouldn't tell Myrtle that. She never liked the idea of my being paroled to Doc. If she got the idea that he was using me, that there was something seriously wrong, I was in a trap, and I couldn't go out by the door. That led back to Sandstone. I had to stay in until I found my own exit. I'm sorry. I didn't know it was a violation of my parole.
Who said it was? What I want to know is why you bought it. That title was transferred yesterday, but the car was still on the sales lot this morning.
Well, I thought I'd pick it up over the weekend.
But why did you buy it, a jalopy like that, when the state lets you have a first-class car for nothing?
Since I don't need it for myself, I obviously intend to resell it. I'm pretty handy with tools. I can fix it up in my spare time and make a little money on it.
Well...
That's what I intend to do, Miss Briscoe.
That's what you intend to do now. Did you honest to God buy that car, Red?
I don't understand.
I don't either, but let it go. Get that car off the lot today, and don't lose any time about reselling it.
Yes, ma'am. You want me to drive back to town ahead of you?
That won't be necessary. I'm trying to help you, Red, and that's all I'm trying to do. Why don't you give me a chance?
Yes, ma'am.
For God's sake, come out of your shell before you rot in it. I'm sure you're in a jam, a damned bad one. Tell me about it.
There's nothing I can tell you.
There. You see? You don't even have to think anymore. You slide off center automatically. Doc's got you mixed up in something and you don't know how to get out of it, hasn't he?
Why should Doc do that?
Red, suppose I told you I knew you were on the level and wanted to stay that way, and any trouble you were in wasn't your own fault.
There's nothing to tell at the moment. But something might come up.
Yes, Red?
I understand you always keep your word. You always make good on a threat or a promise. Tell me you'll trust me to do what I have to do, what I think is right, and that you'll keep me from going back to Sandstone.
That's a pretty big load to buy blind, Red.
But no bigger than the one you're asking me to buy.
Yes, it is. You see, Red, there's such a hell of a lot more involved than just you and me. For almost 10 years now, Doc's crowd has been riding high and handsome. This time, in this coming election, it looks like they're gonna lose out. They're getting desperate. They're looking for some way to discredit me. You could be it.
I don't see how I could be used. Anyway, I've been given to understand that you can stay in office as long as you want to.
I've stayed in for 30 years, but that doesn't mean I can keep on doing it. A first-class scandal will put any office holder in the street. And the straighter he's been, the harder it'll hit him.
But...
Yeah, I know. I didn't sign your parole, but I did consent to it. You get in a really bad scrape and it'll come back on me. Let me get it in the neck and the whole reform slate will collapse. That automatically leaves Doc's crowd in the saddle.
I understand. But how am I going to be used to discredit you?
I don't know, Red. But I can think of any number of things you could do that would pull the trick. That's why I want you to level with me. And I'll go along with you as far as I can. That's a promise.
She stood up tiredly and began brushing at her wrinkled skirt. The sun was full out by now, and it etched every line of her haggard face. Her faded topknot of hair was more gray than red. I stood up also, and she looked up into my face for a moment, squinting against the sun. Then she took hold of my arm, pushed me gently aside, and strode past me and down the hill. Watching her, watching the firm, unfaltering stride, I somehow felt ashamed, and I wanted to run after her or call her back. And I stayed where I was and kept my mouth closed. I knew I was making a mistake. Just how bad a one I was yet to discover. The Capital Car Company had a sales lot on the outskirts of the business district. A salesman directed me to a small frame office surrounded by cars. I introduced myself to the manager, a brisk, gold-toothed little man named Rivers. "Oh, sure. Wife bought it for you. Very fine lady, very fine. Want to take a look at it?" I thought I'd take it with me. "Take it or leave it. Wife said you might want to leave it a while." He led me down a row of automobiles and stopped before a Ford coupe. It wasn't junk by any means, despite the scratched and lusterless body. The tires were new. I lifted the hood and saw an engine as clean as though it had been scrubbed with soap and water. An employee of the company drove the car out to Doc's house for me. Rivers followed in another car to take him back to town. I left the coupe and the state car at the curb and went up the walk to the house. As I climbed the steps, the Venetian blind at one of the front windows moved, and when I opened the front doors, Mrs. Luther was standing in the door of her apartment. She was wearing a flowered silk housecoat with a bodice of some very sheer material. She smiled and stood back from the door, inviting me in.
Now aren't you a bad man? You found out about our surprise.
Is Doc here?
Oh, no, he's gone for the day. Come in.
I stepped inside, stopping as near the door as I could without standing close to her. She closed the door, gave me another bright, chiding smile, and led me to one of the overstuffed lounges. She said, pushing me down on the lounge with a playful gesture.
How'd you find out?
Wasn't I supposed to?
Of course not. Not yet.
Oh, well, you can probably guess, Mrs. Luther. The highway department gets a daily list of title transfers. I saw that I owned a car, so I went down and got it. Shouldn't I have?
Well, as long as you did. We intended to give it to you on your birthday.
Well, that was very nice of you. But my birthday was in March, more than 2 months ago.
Oh, no. Doctor thought it was in May.
That's too bad. If you or Doc want to get your money back... She shook her head doubtfully. She was sure Doc wouldn't want to do that. I murmured more thanks, wondering what went on beneath that vapidly beautiful face. May and March, the months could easily have been confused, and the present of a car wasn't at all out of keeping with Doc's other acts of generosity toward me. I didn't need one immediately, but circumstances might change to where I would. What actually was there to be suspicious about? I looked up at Lila suddenly and caught a peculiar expression in her eyes, something that was a mixture of shame and hunger. I smiled at her, and she smiled back shyly, a faint blush spreading across the tawny cheeks. She felt the blush and tried to fix her face against it. I put out my hand and let the fingers trail across her breasts. She gasped, but didn't pull away. She sat and waited, biting at her lip. "You're out of character, Mrs. Luther. Or are you in character? It's got to be one way or the other."
I don't know what you mean.
I could feel her mind racing, trying to think and not to think at the same time.
You've got no right to question me.
You made one pass at me after another, and you weren't particular where or when you made 'em. And then Hardesty told you to lay off, and you did. You didn't count on my making the passes. You don't know what to do, now that I have.
I know what to do.
Spill it. You were told to begin. You were told to stop. What's it all about? She didn't answer. She wriggled, moving closer to me, and her lips parted. It was a good act, if it was one. I decided to see how good. I caught the bodice with both hands and pulled out and down. It came apart like paper, and she fell against me, flinging her arms around me and crying.
Pat!
It was almost a sob, frantic, hysterical, with passion. I let her draw me forward and down. We still lay together, but I was thinking. The ash-blonde hair was sweetly damp against my face, and her lips brushed my ear, kissing, whispering, and the soft right body began to move again in tentative rhythm. But I was thinking. What if Doc should come in now, I thought. What if the door should open and... The door did open. A silver-backed hairbrush stood on edge on the coffee table, mirroring the opening door. Mirroring Doc. And then, as gently as it had opened and closed again, and cautiously, the screen door opened and closed. Seconds later, I heard the quiet purr of a distant motor. Doc, the insanely jealous, had seen this, and driven away. It had all taken place in seconds, too swiftly for shock and fear to follow, and Lila hadn't seen or heard. I sat up, shock gripping me at last. A cold, weak feeling spread up through my chest and throat, and cold sweat broke out on my forehead.
Darling.
She sat up also, anxiety and hunger blending on her face.
What's the matter?
I don't know. Felt sick all of a sudden.
Maybe you'd better go.
I went. I wanted to tell her, to explain, but perhaps she shouldn't know. I sensed the danger. She couldn't be trusted. She'd lied about the car. She'd lied figuratively ever since I'd come to this house. She knew what was going on, and I didn't. And if I told her this, I didn't know what might happen. But I wasn't going to tell her and find out. The sign on the pebble glass door read E.A. Eggleston, Investigations. The office was in an old 5-story building down near the public market. He couldn't be too good, I thought, being in that location. He didn't have to be good to know what I wanted to, and I didn't want anyone that would be really sharp, that would get ideas and follow them up. He was tall and thin-faced and drowsy-looking. His scuffed crepe-soled shoes were up on his desk when I went in, and his big bony hands were folded across his stomach. Crumpled gray hat was pulled low on his forehead. He didn't shift the hat or his position during the half hour or so that I was there. Cosgrove. What do you do, Cosgrove? You have to know that? Got to know whether you're worth killing. Whether you're in a business, say, which would suffer from your permanent absence. I'm not. No dependent, no close relative, no wife. But you think you may have been insured without your knowledge. Why, yes. Why? Well, about a month ago, a certain party did me a very expensive favor. Since then, I've received several others. I've never met this party before, and I can't think of any way I could provide a return on the investment unless I've been insured. Ask this party why he or she had done said favors? Well, not a straight question. The implication was that they were pure philanthropy. That doesn't fit in with what I know about this party. He sat motionless, silent, staring down at his hands. I thought there might be some sort of underwriter's bureau that could give you the information, without, of course, letting this party know that I'd ask. It'll cost you $20, Mr. Cosgrove. I took out a 20 and laid it on the desk. He lifted a foot slightly and dragged the bill under his heel. You're not insured, Mr. Cosgrove. Anything else? Now, look, I paid for certain information, which you received on very good authority. I've done a great deal of insurance work. No one has taken out a policy on you, providing you've told me the truth. For one party to insure another, he must have what is known as an insurable interest. He must present reasonably good evidence that he has little or nothing more to gain by the insurer's demise than he has by his continued existence. The insured's death must represent a sentimental loss, as in the case of husband and wife, a monetary one, or both. No one, it would appear, has an insurable interest in you." He stopped, and I stood up. "By the way, Mr. Cosgrove, anyone with the education which you ostensibly have should have known he wasn't insured. Anyone who gets around at all would know it. Maybe I don't get around very much. I was pretty sure I wasn't insured, but I thought things might have changed recently." "Not that recently, Mr. Cosgrove. You're still a young man. You couldn't have been out of circulation very long. Goodbye. Why don't you remove yourself from this party's vicinity, from the state, for that matter?" I stopped and turned. He nodded drowsily. "You can't leave, can you? I'm beginning to think you might have excellent grounds for your suspicions. Another 20, please." I went back to the desk and laid a second bill on it. He raked it under his heel. "How long were you in, Mr. Cosgrove?" 15 years of tender life. "And you were unacquainted with the party who got your parole? Bought it, shall we say?" "That's right." "So are you, Mr. Cosgrove. You have good reason for alarm. A pardon could have been obtained as cheaply and easily. With a pardon you could have gone away, far out of your benefactor's periphery. He is not a philanthropist.